in escape room design. This could be really interesting. But right now, so anybody that's come in, if you'd like to ask any questions, there is a chat box at the bottom of the screen. We can't hear you, we can't see you, so we don't know that you have a question unless you put it in the chat box, and then we'll get to it as soon as we can. So right now, we'll take it over, Jasmine and Joshua.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for having us and a great introduction. So we are Live History. You may not have heard of us or been to our escape rooms because we're not an escape room, and yet we are. So to give you a brief overview of what we do, Live History is a site-specific, internationally touring, historic, customizable mystery theater company. You always need a lot of air when you say that. So what that means is instead of having a physical location that participants come and play our games, and it's always in the same spot, we tour all around the world. We tour 10 countries and over 200 venues. And we work with local historic sites, museums, and exhibit-based museums, customizing our shows and our mysteries to work with their local history and their sites. So in one way, you know, it's great because we're always in a different place. We always have cool new facts to work in. And in the other way, is really hard because the escape room that we built yesterday is not there tomorrow. We have to do something completely different. So just to tell you a little bit about ourselves, I was originally an actor in Toronto. I have a BA from the University of Toronto in theater, and I wanted a new way for people to engage with museums and engage with history. And I knew that the generation growing up now wanted an interactive experience. They just didn't want to go to museums and look at the beautiful things that are there. They wanted to be involved. They wanted to be immersed in history. So I took my interest in history, my degree in theater. I created these theatrical escape room shows. But it turns out I could only do the theater part and not the escape room part. So I needed someone more than an actor, different than an actor.
Mm-hmm. So a big thing for us is we knew we wanted our shows to be interactive in some capacity. And a great fit for that was the escape room element, to have people actually solving puzzles and working on things as they're interacting with our characters and our historic performers. So I've been Live History's lead show designer since the company started in 2015, designed a lot of shows for them. I have a bit of a game design background in general in terms of I've designed some simulation games for university and college courses and a tabletop role-playing game. But the focus here is not that. It's how we work in history into our escape room type clues and puzzles.
Yeah, so we're speaking to you from two different perspectives today. You are hopefully here because you are a fan of history too, or you know that history escape rooms can sell pretty well. And you want your escape rooms to appeal not only to the people who want a cool escape room, but those history buffs who walk in and they're like, oh, I just actually stepped onto the Titanic. Actually, as history fans outside of Live History, we played a lot of escape rooms where we know the history of the room or the history of the story going in, and then we walk into that escape room and we're like, oh, there's just kind of overarching story, but all of the history that I know about this person or about this event isn't in the room. And I was kind of hoping for that. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So we have this nifty presentation
we're going to share, which we hope you all can see.
Pretty sure we'll be able to see the Q&A too if it pops up.
Excellent. We're getting a thumbs up, so I think.
Yeah. All right. So adding history to your escape room puzzles. How do you make it feel real? How do you take these obscure historic facts and make it feel like they exist inside your facility? How do you make it accurate? So we're going to go over a bunch of different things today. Do you want to?
We've already introduced ourselves a little bit, but we might add a couple things to that. We're going to talk in general about good places to get some research done and places you may want to look. We're going to talk about some examples from shows that we have done, from escape games that we've created for different facilities. And then we're going to touch on some general tips and props that you might be considering, and we'll have some concluding remarks and time for questions.
Yeah. So to give you kind of the overview, I mentioned that we don't get to build our facilities from scratch. The castles frown upon us knocking down walls so we can create like a secret doorway. So we don't have that advantage that you have. So we do two different things. When we go into the facilities that hire us, we usually know what they look like beforehand. We have videos and pictures. The show design team has seen it inside and out. And then we travel with a lot of our props that we've worked very hard to make sure look as historically accurate as possible. There are advantages to that because we can move our props around and kind of put them wherever, but sometimes we get to places and we're like, oh, that does not look like the picture. How are we going to work this mystery in there?
And we do. We have to make revisions sometimes on the fly, and you bring blank copies of things that you can have so that you can make revisions and so on.
We have worked in different facilities, and let's see if I can do them all. I'll probably forget one. Bermuda, America, Canada, Ireland, England, Scotland, Wales, Australia, New Zealand. That's probably all of them. I might have forgotten one or two.
Every province in Canada besides PEI and Newfoundland.
Yeah, and Newfoundland. And we've even been up to the Yukon in all these different places. We don't only work in museums. We design for libraries, historic venues, one-room schoolhouses, churches, town halls. We've been on ships. The HMS Haida in Hamilton, Ontario was probably one of our favorites. We've been in big castles. We've been in castles that were big castles and other piles of stones. So we really have to think outside the box for that. So that's just to give you an idea of the different designs that we make. All of our history is customized to the local area as well. So we don't just work in Canadian history for 150 years. Our earliest show was 1283 in Conway Castle, and our latest show this year, if the season happens, will be in 1970. So we work with all kinds of history.
A wide range. So I think we've already introduced ourselves a little bit. If you've wanted to, you've read those points already, so I don't think we need to belabor them. We'll just move on to research and where you might want to look for some of your historical information. Wikipedia is obviously a place that you can start. It's usually a good place to start, and you want to do more digging beyond that. And some of those places that you might want to dig into are things like what we have listed here.
Yeah, so Wiki is great because it gives you an overview, but you have to remember that normal people can edit Wiki. Normal people who maybe haven't read firsthand sources can edit Wiki, or normal people who suddenly have a vendetta against General Brock can edit Wiki. So you can start there, but don't go off. We have our own history department who does our research, and she has worked with all sorts of ridiculous sources. Graveyards. I know graveyards seem like maybe an odd place to do research. What are those people going to tell you? All it says is their name and their birth date and, beloved son of so-and-so. Graveyards are a great place if you want to get family names from the town. Especially the small towns where maybe the records weren't kept up to date. As the bigger towns, they didn't have the budget, or they only have one newspaper in town, and once that guy died, that was it. Searching the graveyards and places like Find a Grave, and you just go through and you're like, oh, this family name appears 10 times on these graves. This family name appears 20 times, and it spans from 1775 to 1970. So it's probably safe to say they were a staple of the town.
Yeah, they're a prominent family.
They're a prominent family. It's also a place to find interesting things. Like if you go through the graveyards and they're all English and Scottish names, and then there's that one German name, and you're like, oh, maybe that guy has a story. So don't be afraid to search findagrave.com. We totally recommend it at like 3 a.m. by yourself in the dark.
That seems like you don't need to follow all of that advice. Some of it is good.
Yeah. The next one is archives. Some archives are easy to find. Some bigger cities have digitalized them all. A lot of cities are starting to do that. COVID, everyone's digitalizing everything. So there's an advantage there. Smaller cities may be willing to do things like, oh yeah, we will totally mail you this book from our archives and mail it back when you're done. Do you remember like working with the city of Trenton?
Yep.
And I said, hey, like there's a lot of history that I can't just find online, and I need to find a prominent local figure who nobody would know, but everyone would know by the end of the show because we were giving hints about who that person was. And they're like, oh yeah, we are totally going to put in an envelope a bunch of books that haven't been cracked open in 50 years, and we're going to mail them to you. I find that a lot of those archive books too have a lot of oral stories that have since dropped out of society. So you can be reading that book and you can be like, oh, you know, Jane owned the store in 50 years and then Jane moved away and passed away somewhere else. So her grave isn't in town and no one there remembers her. So her story has disappeared until you read that book.
And this probably ties into my big takeaway, which is if you can ever find a primary source of information, right? Like these oral histories that would be written down in some of these books, letters that have been written to people, that's an awesome thing to incorporate into your mystery, right? Actual passages from that actual historical message in some capacity. You might customize it a little bit, but be inspired from that and use it as much as you can. Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically of, we worked in White River, which is very, very far north of Ottawa, where we are. And White River has the story of capturing the bear that was Winnie the Pooh's mother, which not a lot of people know. You might be able to find that story online, but the people involved and the people surrounding it, you never would find unless you talk to the town specifically and the people there. So if your escape room for some reason was about a small northern town in Ontario and you wanted to go bear hunting, and you want to make it accurate, you actually have to go and call the town. And those people, and this is going to be more relevant later, those people who are super Winnie the Pooh fans, if you just name drop one name in there that was present or one of the founding families of the town for a really long time, they're going to pick up on it right away. And it's going to make the experience that much more real for them. You don't need a big poster that says, and now, you know, you're going to open a letter from John Smith. John Smith was a founding member of White River, and John Smith did this and this and this and this and this. You don't need that. Those real history fans are going to feel so much more immersed because that name is there. That name that we know is like a little nugget more immersion for them. So that goes along with like making phone calls. Don't be afraid to call the local shop that says longest standing local shop in town. Don't be afraid to call the museum. Don't be afraid to write to the Historic Society that probably has had the same members for 50 years. They are a wealth of information, but sometimes the stories that they have don't make it more than 5 kilometers down the road. And you've done some interesting research when you're show designing, where you spend hours and hours like reading firsthand historic writing.
I mean, it's even sometimes little things like trying to figure out like what does a soldier in 1812 eat, right? Like what were their rations? So you try to find a resource that's close to that date that says, well, they're being fed this, this, and this, and then maybe you're making a problem based off of that information.
Yeah.
But you want to find that resource that confirms that you're kind of on the right track.
Yeah. And a lot of this is to say, you know, it could be summed up in a way of just make it accurate. Don't do something that's not accurate. But that's not easy, especially when you're trying to build a puzzle and the soldiers in 1812 were not aware of the puzzle you're trying to build in 2020. So they didn't leave clues for you. They didn't make it easy. And you have to think of it not so much like building your escape room and then finding facts. It's the other way around. It's finding the facts and then building the mystery out of it. And we'll talk about that later. That's an interesting flashing going on this side. It's fine. We'll just all right. So we wanted to give you some specific examples of some of this because in 200 venues, we have been in scenarios where we're like, oh, how are we going to do that? Or the client's like, hey, I have this great local legend that you need to include. And when they tell us it, we're like, yeah, that is a great local legend. What are we going to do?
So for this particular example, we did a show in Fort Malden in 2017, which was set right after the Siege of Detroit, which is kind of a famous event from the War of 1812. General Brock was victorious with basically no loss of life on the British Canadian side. And we had a show set right after that and had a bunch of clues and puzzles. The next year, we had a request from a client to do that show, but in a completely different location, in a different fort.
Yeah. So that was interesting because, they were like, that show was so great. I want those same characters. They were beautiful. I love that storyline, but can you do it in Fort Wellington, which is 8 hours down the road? And also General Brock never went there. We're like, oh, great.
So we spent a lot of time, I think mostly me, spent a lot of time poring over actual historic letters that were exchanged between Brock and the Governor General and a bunch of the other military figures at the time, trying to find out, well, where exactly was he, and is there a date we can put him where he could plausibly be at Fort Wellington?
Yes. So what happened with Malden was, it was called Amherstburg at the time, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Also, a good note. It was Malden in 2017, but that's not what they would have called it when they were marching around the fort. So, yeah. So they had the Siege of Detroit, which was perfect. According to the art of war, a great victory with 0 loss of life. So General Brock's up there. They got the American prisoners, and then they paraded them all the way back to
Montreal.
Okay. So we knew that. We knew that everyone was really happy. We knew they paraded them back to Montreal. We knew our geography. Josh mostly knew his geography. We knew that Kingston, Prescott was sort of on the way to Montreal. But the client was so insistent. I'm like, how about another general? There were other generals there. There were other people. And she's like, nope, I need Brock. Great. So as Josh was saying, you read the letter. And we knew that the character that you see on the screen, the man in the foreground, is John McDonnell, who was General Brock's aide-de-camp, who was from the Prescott area.
Yeah, absolutely. And there were a bunch of kind of specific concerns about it. One was the fort even there at the time? Because they didn't have any proof that it was at the time. And this is the museum itself saying this. And we discovered, there's been a colonel with a unit stationed there since the outbreak of the war.
Okay, so
there's
we declared,
sort of fortification.
There's a fort there. This gives us hope.
There is an armed camp there.
Yeah.
There are messages from Montreal to Kingston about a unit of men being dispatched to Prescott to meet the American prisoners. So we have specifically found that.
Our prisoners from Malden are coming this way.
Will actually be in Prescott.
Great.
Perfect.
Maybe we can build this mystery.
And then we discovered that there is a gap where General Brock isn't sending any letters from anywhere specific. We have about 7 days or so where he could certainly have gone from Kingston, which is where we know he was, to visit Prescott.
And we know that John McDonnell, his aide-de-camp, his brilliant young boy genius, is from the Prescott area. And we also know that Brock was planning an attack across the river. And
on Sackett's Harbor.
Yeah, on Sackett's Harbor, and probably wanted to check out the new fort. So we dug and we dug and we dug and we dug and we dug. Having that gap, knowing how intelligent a man Brock was, knowing that McDonnell was from the area where this new fort was built, all of a sudden, you have this plausible reason that through all this research that says, yes, he could have slipped away and been there. He probably was. And he didn't want anyone to know because that would have messed up a whole bunch of plans. But he suddenly stopped writing letters. And this is a man who continuously wrote letters. If General Brock lived today, he would be that guy who texts you every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
He wrote a lot of letters.
So why don't we show a specific example of a puzzle we made from our first show?
Yeah.
So this is just a logic problem that our participants would need to solve. All of the units here were actual units that would have been at Fort Amherstburg, Fort Malden.
Sandwich.
Yep.
Yeah.
And these were all supplies that would have been here.
Yeah. Now, where did you didn't just make these up?
No, of course. We had specific documentation that say the Essex militia are here. Those are the local militia for Fort Malden. We knew they were fighting in the area. The York militia, we got some specific intelligence that it was there. One of our characters who we know was there was in charge of the York militia. Tecumseh was there, so there were definitely some native warriors who were helping out. And we had some British regulars and a cavalry unit. Yeah,
and this is why these are the names they would have called themselves at the time. We also knew that they had cannons. Hopefully, they were going to fight a battle. Powder wagons, important for cannons. American prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel
Nichols was in charge of. He's sort of the quartermaster general at the time.
And that's a real guy.
So yes, a real person. So anytime you can use a real historic person, you want to incorporate it.
Yeah. So when Josh built this problem, it took obviously tons of research, but it wasn't. I feel like you worked backwards the same way. You were like, oh hey, all these militia units are here. Oh hey, they have a bunch of stuff. What can I do with this stuff? Rather than I would like them to solve a problem. Let me go and see if I can make history fit my problem. Yeah.
It's always good to start by learning some of the historical context and be inspired from that historical context to make your problems.
Yeah. So we're not going to make you solve this.
No.
Not in this. This is not interactive, but next time.
That's right.
Yeah.
And then here we have a specific letter that is inspired from actual letters, and we've added some simple, Roman numerals for people to solve.
Roman numerals instead of dates.
Yeah, and you need this and another piece to do a bit of a math problem to solve when the people were actually arriving.
Yeah.
In the area.
So what makes this so cool, and it actually makes it less work for you, is you don't have to sit there and be like, I don't know how they talked in 1812. You don't need to figure it out. They did it for you.
Yes. There are records that you can find of army officers writing to each other and so on.
Yeah, and it's just a simple matter of like, you've changed the numbers and moved those around. And anyone who went and looked at the letters, I mean, this isn't Brock's letter, but within the, looked at the letters would be like, oh, that they really did say that Paul and the prisoners are going to Prescott. This was a real letter that was sent. It helps with your work too, because you don't have to run the risk of making a historic error when you're using actual letters. It's almost like they knew about our escape room.
I don't know if I'd go that far. No, but so this was a very useful resource for this particular time period for us that we used. So anything that has actual correspondence in it can be a real boon to any design you're working on.
And you read hundreds of those letters.
I feel like I read the book multiple times.
You read the book multiple times. But that was the best because it was firsthand. We didn't have to guess. They had done it for us. Cool. But we don't always work in Canada. And working in Canada, a lot of the history that we think of is more recorded. Sometimes we get in trouble and the client goes, okay, 1283, Conway Castle, the very beginning of Conway Castle. Oh, there are not a lot of letters from 1283. Oh no. Also, Conway doesn't have any walls. No, they have walls. Conway doesn't have any roofs.
Yes, no ceiling.
No ceilings. Oh boy. Also, the castle would frown upon us creating a trapdoor in there. So this is just to speak first to sets. When you are building historically accurate sets, you do not need to build the whole castle. Ruins are just as powerful as the whole castle.
Just a few touches to set the scene are often all you need.
And you can play with that too. So as you can see, Conway is in ruins. So we had a couple choices with this. We could pretend that there was a roof on all of the ruins, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted my audience to really believe they were exactly where they were. So then I had two choices from there. I could set the show after the castle was in ruins, or I could set the show when the castle was being built. And I decided to do that. The stories were just more powerful then. There was more to tell. There was more interesting things happening in the area, and I didn't need the roof. And if I owned an escape room, I could also say that we don't need to build the roof because the castle's being built. So don't worry, just set some rocks around.
I mean, they probably already have a roof.
Yeah, I think escape rooms have roofs.
Probably.
So Conway's another great one where we really had to dig into the history because we were given nothing. The client was very kind in the sense that they said, we want you to believe in the story that you tell. Okay, great. Now I have to read 800 years of history. Luckily, castles are my favorite. So I may have spent more time on that job than I needed to. But in reading all that history,
it's important. If you have somebody who's passionate about history on your team, use them, right? Because the more they'll dig in and be passionate about it, the better.
And the more intricate little stories that they're going to tell.
That's right.
We call it the wiki rabbit hole, where you start clicking, like say in Renaissance England, and you click on this guy and this guy, and then 3 hours later, you're in ancient Egypt. You're like, oh,
how did I get
here? I learned a whole bunch, I think. Anyway, the story at Conway was quite interesting because there were so many people involved in building this castle. And we wanted to tell obvious stories and yet not obvious stories, but we didn't know what we wanted to do. We didn't go in saying, okay, we want to do the biggest battle at Conway, so let's find all the people that were involved in that. We were looking for the characters that were the most important to the locals. Stories that weren't being told, stories that were in danger of being forgotten, and yet stories that history buffs would know right away at the same time. Because a lot of people who do visit castles and forts, they are there to look for the zipper on the back of the pillowcase and be very disappointed by it when it's put there. I've heard history buffs complain. So we chose 3. Oops, I was going to go over the characters. Jump back.
Oh, sure. Well, a couple of them are mentioned there.
Yeah. We chose 3 different characters. I'm pointing like you can all see me. So on the far side, wearing the crown, Queen Eleanor. Eleanor is probably the most well-known figure in the story. So we had to have one well-known figure. We chose her because she and her husband, Edward, had a Get Stuff Done campaign, where from the age of 13 all the way up until they died, Eleanor and Edward had half a dozen children, and they built all these castles, and they took Wales, and eventually Edward got involved with Scotland too. Yeah.
And he got involved with Scotland because of the guy in the middle there.
Yeah. So the guy in the middle is Prince Alexander of Wales, or Scotland. My goodness. You probably never heard of Prince Alexander of Scotland unless you really dive into these stories, but he is the reason that Braveheart happened. So Alexander is the niece of Eleanor, or the nephew of Eleanor and Edward. His father, King Alexander of Scotland II, had 3 children. So he thought he was pretty good with his throne. He thought he was safe. And then Alexander's brother died. And then Alexander's sister died. And then Alexander died, and he was 20. So all of a sudden, King Alexander of Scotland is left with only one heir, and it's the infant child of Alexander's sister, Margaret, the daughter. And then she doesn't last very long either. And all of a sudden, there's a war for the Scottish throne, and Braveheart happens. And everyone knows the story of Braveheart, but only the real history buffs recognized Prince Alexander the second he introduced himself. And as soon as he said, yeah, my father is King Alexander II, the real history buffs went.
As soon as they met him.
As soon as they met him. And he didn't need to say, and in 20 days, basically, I'm gonna die. No. And he didn't need to say, and my father goes on to do all this. And he didn't need to say Braveheart. The real history buffs immediately met him, and they spent hours and hours talking to him, the poor boy, because they knew what happened to him. And, like, his fate would be changed. And then on the first side, you have me, and I was actually the lady in waiting to Eleanor, one of the only ones in history that is named, but didn't have a lot of a story. So we didn't want her story to
be forgotten.
Yeah, you can jump.
Absolutely. So on the one side, we have some of the context of the story that Jasmine just went over, and we have a simple problem that used the space that we were in. This show is designed a little less like an escape room and a little more like a mission and quest. Adventure experience. So you were going and completing tasks. You weren't, based on how many tasks you completed and what task you completed, that would determine what position you got at court. So a bit of a different kind of experience than a traditional escape room.
One advantage too, that if you don't want to use kings and queens and princes, but you still want to mold a historically accurate story, I mentioned it on the other page, is that look at the peasants, look at the servants, look at the people whose names are barely mentioned and their stories are not told. And you can take a whole bunch of general stories and put them together, and you can still have a historically accurate tale that works a little bit with the Play-Doh of your mystery. And that was fun. I think we have some Q&As. Sorry if we haven't been paying any attention. We're learning this program, but maybe we can answer some of these.
You want to take a pause?
Yeah, because we did say we will answer them right away. So we'll take the first one. I really admire your efforts to incorporate architecture. Do you ever find that despite your efforts, sometimes you just have to trust that the players will have a suspension of disbelief when it comes to imagining how the historic sites would have looked? No, I would say, because we work very hard. Like when we go into historic houses and castles, they have long periods of history. We always ask them, like, hey, I know your historic house had people live in it for 150 years. What era is it set to? And they say, the house was built in 1812, but all the furniture in there is 1930. So it's set to the family that lived in the 30s. Cool. That's when the show's going to be.
Yeah, and I mean, this is not necessarily applicable to a traditional escape room, but in our experience, even if there is a display case that is clearly anachronistic to the time period in the space, people will still manage to immerse themselves in the experience.
Yeah, because there have been a few times where the client said, oh, we're a historic house, and we get there and we're like, you're not a historic house. You're an exhibit-based museum. Just because you're housed in a house.
In a historic house.
And since then, we've had to ask clients the very awkward question of, do you look historic on the inside? And it's always been strange, but it saved us.
Yeah, so I think some of the minor things are really like, if you're getting an object, try to make sure that it's a replica of something that you found elsewhere, or something that could plausibly be like that, because certainly if some people are picking it up and handling it, you want it to be something that seems like that.
Yeah.
Really simple things like if there's stickers on it, make sure that there aren't any stickers on it anymore. Stuff you all know.
Yeah, and that kind of goes into this. One challenge I've found in putting historical facts into escape room is that it is easiest to do with letters, but Customers often don't like to get bogged down with reading. What are creative ways to place facts besides through reading? Want to grab writing, sorry, the cork. Yeah, so we got one right here because we're totally not sitting in our props room right now. Something really simple, like, yeah, doesn't matter. Corks. Corks have been around forever. And they don't have to read a whole letter to see XXV carved into the cork. Historic facts could be carved into corks. I mean, it could be something like a signature, could be.
I mean, there's like historical coding systems. Like I was watching something interesting about tally sticks. Yeah. About how you would cut patterns in sticks to keep track of money in primarily medieval times, but throughout history. So there's lots of ways to have historical.
We just had a request that if you're going to show something on your screen, could you not share the big screen so we could see what you're showing?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. All I was holding up was a cork. So
if we have something, you need to do that.
You could just, absolutely. Stop share there. A cork, simple cork that you get out of a wine bottle. Yeah. Cork is fairly easy. You just have to be careful with cork because a lot of them have logos carved on it now, or printed on them. So if you are using something like corks, I don't know where the one with the logo went on, but you just have to make sure that you sand them off. You can use literally anything. We've used candles for putting actual facts into it, though. I like something as simple as getting an old book and writing someone's name on it. Photos, historic photos.
Historic photos are actually a big one that we were gonna. Yeah. Well, we can touch on it right now. So we've done like elimination games with historic photos relating to an actual photographer, historic character that we've used. But you can even have photos of historic locations and things like that that have been taken in the past, and incorporate that in your game somehow as well. Yeah. Or paintings, photos of the paintings, etc.
Yeah, something like that. You don't necessarily need big block text to teach people. You know, having an old book with someone's name scrawled into it and the date, like Jane Smith, 1856. And you're like, oh, cool. Jane Smith was around in 1856, and this is a grade school textbook, so she was probably in grade school in 1856. And all you did was write 3 words in there with ink.
And if you are using letters, I often do truncate them, right? So you're not reading the entire letter that the person originally wrote. You're writing some piece of the letter. Yeah. And you might add a bit of peanut butter to make the letter flow properly and have all the context that you're looking for.
Yeah. So hopefully that helps. There's obviously a lot of research that you put into your experiences. Where do you draw the line? Is there a risk of overloading players with info? And there's a supplementary material available for afterwards in case they want to know more. That's a great question. Yes. One of our shows that ran for several years and actually gave us a Governor General seal for history and community programming was the story of a character who didn't know who they were. And so through the show and all the props you found and all the information you found about them, there were tidbits dropped. I was married in 1665. I had 5 children. I came here on a boat in England. And then at the end of the show, there's a little bit more information about them. Oh, I remember everything about my life now. I remember this, 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 and this. And then usually most clients would do a handout afterwards of that person, especially because they were relevant to the local community. So you don't want your facts to get to overload the story in a way. Yeah. You're there to tell a story about that specific moment in history, I assume, or that specific, if you don't know, fort or that specific thing. But you still need to tell your story. So if Jane Smith had a kid in 1665, and then in, I don't know, 1700 because she's very old, bought a pig, the pig can be in the handout later. We're focusing on Jane Smith's life in 1665, and it's the kid and the dog that she got.
Yeah, and we almost always, just like a lot of escape rooms, have a verbal intro that sets some of the stage of our show and some of the historical context.
Yeah.
And then we often also have a verbal outro that provides a bit of history of what happened after the experience is over, so that people can really frame it in their minds.
Yeah.
So that's something you could certainly consider doing as well.
Yeah. Pick your moment in history, whatever your escape room is, the Gold Rush, the War of 1812, pick your moment and only use facts that are relevant to that moment, I would say. Cool. So we'll try to pay a little more attention if questions pop up there, but those were great questions and a great kind of
a nice break.
A nice break. So back to 1283, where it was so cold. So we knew, for example, that this well existed because it was there. And we really wanted people to interact with it, but aside from actually throwing stuff down into it,
which you're not allowed to do.
You're not allowed to do. Do not go to the castle and do that. So Josh wrote this great problem for it.
Which is kind of a basic math problem, and if you could zoom in on that picture, you would be able to see the rest of the info that you need to solve it. So in this case, the individual just has to go to the well, read the sign, and be able to do some math. Yeah.
And you're still interacting with the well. It's still historically accurate because you know how deep it is. So you're using a historic fact, but you want to figure out how they got there.
Yeah. So, and conceptually for our show, this is you're going and talking to some builder who's working on it, asking how deep it's going to be.
Yeah.
But you just happen to learn that information by actually looking at a sign.
And this is a good way to work backwards too. We knew there was a well in Conway Castle that was this deep. Josh learned about the well, and then he wrote the math problem. He didn't design a problem really hoping there was a well in Conway.
That's right.
Work backwards. All right. Cool. Props. So we have gone into escape rooms and been like, this is not accurate. We were not the people who found the zippers on the pillows, but
I don't care about zippers.
You're fine. Other people have. We've gone into escape rooms. I remember going into one that was set in a particular time period and actually read up about that time period before we went in that specific historic event, thinking, okay, my knowledge about this historic event is going to help. I'm at least going to know what year it happened, what people were involved, how it happened, and that's going to help me get out of the escape room. And it was advertised as an escape room about this specific historic event. And we went in, and it literally had nothing to do with that. Not really.
It felt like thematic window dressing is probably the best way to put it.
Yeah.
Which, if you have people who are coming for a particular historic feel, they're going to be a little disappointed. So you want to try to include mentions of some of the characters' names that are familiar from the history, or even a couple that maybe aren't that familiar. And then that person who's really into that can look them up afterwards.
Yeah. And I think with this specific escape room too, it wasn't advertised as the fact that they were just going to take this name and move it forward to 2020, which is kind of what happened. And so the history buff in me had my heart broken. There were still some great puzzles, but so how do you make it feel real? How do you make people walk in and go, I'm really in the sport, without spending millions of dollars on your design? Because we know that budget and design costs can take up a lot, and they can be the door that closes in a way. So you want to start with photos?
Yeah, so I talked about this a little bit already, so I don't want to belabor it, but using historical photos can be a good way to integrate things, particularly archived photos that you found of actual things from the time period that you're setting it in. Railway timetables is always a fun thing that people can play with. Keep in mind that depending on what year you're setting in it, people might not be using daylight saving times. Every single town might have its own time zone. time standardization. So those are things that you can play with and involve in your mystery as well.
So for those of you like from the GTA, back in the day before daylight savings, the townships kind of around, they were called different things, but Oshawa, Pickering, Toronto, Mississauga, they were all on different times. And I'm not talking easy times, like they were all an hour apart. No, they were
7 minutes,
7 minutes ahead of each other.
14 minutes apart, those sorts of things.
Which there's a lot of great math that you can do in there. And something like railway timetables are pretty cheap and easy to create. And yet
you can
still
find
have
some resources for that.
Yeah, still have an accurate feel. Oh, a railway timetable. Logos and stickers on your props. If you're like us, most of your props come from Value Village for 2 reasons. 1, they're cheap, and 2, if people break them, you're not going to cry. Or if your actors break them.
That has definitely happened.
Show designer doesn't cry. But I have been to escape rooms where I've walked in and there was a sticker on the bottom of it, and it wasn't the sticker that said "Do not touch." We're familiar with those stickers, or the sticker that had a clue. It was a sticker left on from Value Village, and when I mentioned it,
and it was on like a simple thing like this that you'd expect to be able to pick up. Right. So.
You want to hold that up a little bit?
Yeah. Sure. So like just a cup or something that you could pick up, and on the bottom there was a sticker. So you just be careful, check everything. That's really the point.
And when I mentioned it to the worker at the time, they said, "Oh yeah, that was just left on from the thrift store, and we couldn't get it off." Okay, but we're in the African Sahara, trying to unlock a secret treasure. I didn't know they had thrift stores out here.
Yeah,
cool.
Depending on what you're working with, a little metal scraper or some sanding would do wonders.
Yeah, or like a bottle. We just did a historic speakeasy show. So in a speakeasy, you have lots of alcohol, but these are not the ones we ended up using. You might want to take the plastic cap off. I know that's a lot of work, but anyone who walks into a historic speakeasy and sees that plastic cap is going to have their disbelief dropped. And you don't want that. You don't want moments to take them out of the story if they're there for a historically accurate experience. Oh, good.
Absolutely.
Old things are always older than you think. So often older, not always. There's a lot of things in modern day that we're used to relying on. And when you have escape rooms that go back in history, you might be like, "Oh, I can't use that." Check, because maybe you can. X-rays came about in 1895. So you have quite a gap where you can use X-rays. Coca-Cola was invented in 1892. May have had actual cocaine in it then, but...
For ourselves, we're always looking up turns of phrase and stuff and colloquialisms and trying to see like when did people actually start using them to try to keep that realism, because we have so much dialogue in our productions, of course. So things like Peeping Tom are really quite old. So all of these sorts of things are things that you might want to look up. In general, it's if you have any doubt whatsoever about pretty much anything you're putting in your historic escape room, check.
Yeah.
Did they have this sort of thing? A quick search will usually tell you.
Yeah. And I'm sure they had Peeping Toms before 1773. They just didn't call them that.
Right.
Another note that I want to say is that people are the same in a lot of ways. Like people's motivations, young 12-year-olds in 1773 could be selfish and could just want to be independent, the same as they can be in 2020. So while you may not have the opportunity to check that, humanity, you're all humans, and you can use that to fill in the gaps where history kind of goes quiet. Why did he do this? Probably because he was 12. Doesn't matter what year we're in. Inspirations rather than copying. So I love to watch historic TV. You do too. We like to watch different time periods.
Yep.
They're not accurate. do not watch Rain and think that those dresses that are bare-shouldered and fluffy are accurate, because they're not. Medici's okay, but what you're looking for is not every single historic fact. Oh, I saw Mr. Medici say this, so it must have happened. No, I saw Mr. Medici going to the council and using stones to vote in political council. Stone voting. Huh. And after we saw that episode, we're like, using stones to vote. We could totally put that into our shows.
Mm-hmm.
Tally sticks.
Yeah, I saw an interesting video on tally sticks. They were all stored in Parliament for in the UK until I saw something like late 1800s, and then somebody ordered them all to be burned.
And all those records,
all the records of people paying taxes that were recorded on tally sticks were burnt up, and it actually caused the whole Parliament to burn down. So what an interesting time. And
tally sticks are great because you had a copy and the tax man had a copy.
Yeah,
and they had to match
to prove things.
Yeah, and they had to match.
So a very interesting thing. And little things like, oh, I saw that they had an hourglass in this thing. Is that correct? Like, check it out. It usually is. But again, always good to verify. Do a little bit of your own research. Don't take it for granted that it's accurate.
Yeah. I would say read nonfiction rather than fiction. Fiction's great, but the nonfiction is going to tell you about people and their day-to-day lives, and day-to-day is where you get the accuracy. What they do in the big battles, they generally didn't have the big battle every day. But what did they do on a normal Tuesday? Did they pick up their tally stick? How did they brush their teeth? What did they do in the afternoons? Those are going to give you the little pieces that you need to build the accuracy.
How were people paying for things?
How did they pay for things?
And keeping records.
Yeah. Cool. So this sort of brings us to the end, and a shameless plug. This is an advertisement for our show. It is called Roundtable International Waters. It is happening May 16th at 3 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. It is our first kind of foray, not into online shows, but like the rest of you, we are trying to survive and trying to find new ways to engage audiences and keep ourselves afloat. But Unch is the boat show. But we wanted to use this advertisement not because we wanted to tell you all to come to the show because it's great. You'll be on the Carpathia. They rescued the Titanic passengers, and there's something missing that you have to find. But because this is taken and edited from an actual newspaper of the time.
Mm-hmm. So the basic layout in this is an actual newspaper that would have been in New York in around 1912. Sort of this type of headings are enlarged a little bit so that they're easier to read for us and so on. But the photograph there is an actual photo of the Carpathia while it's sailing away from the dock. So incorporating these little elements are things that we always try to do, and we encourage you to try to do as well.
Yeah. Do I just click? Nope.
But yes.
Learning technology. Oops. This is why Josh is the show designer. So this kind of brings us to the end. Before we kind of give you our concluding message, are there any questions? And I know that it takes people like a second to type them. So maybe while we wait for Q&A to pop up, we will tell you a little bit more about Roundtable International Waters. So it is set on the Carpathia on April 14th, 1912. Pause. And the reason I pause is because that may not mean anything to you except, cool, it's 1912. But if you're a Titanic history buff and you're coming to your show, you know right away that that's the day the Titanic sunk and set the distress signal to the Carpathia. And you know the Carpathia is the ship that rescued the passengers. And you know that this birthday party is happening late at night. And you know that the distress signal came just after midnight. All of that from just dropping one little date.
That's right.
Yeah. Q&A.
So if you are interested in that, we would love to have you come out to our event on Saturday at 3 p.m. and you can sign up on
the site, on your site. No,
Well, the tickets are available on Eventbrite.
Yeah.
You should be able to find them.
Yeah. So it is Saturday, May 16th at 3 p.m. There are only 20 spaces. It is fully interactive, immersive. You should feel like you're really on the ship, really solving these puzzles. And the tickets are pay what you can. We appreciate anything, but we also want you to feel like there is no barrier to entry if you can't. Question.
There is a question there.
I have a master's degree in history and escape room business that uses historic themes and would love to do a PhD on a communication of history through escape rooms and interactive theater. Do you recon there's enough on the subject and a bit of research to help in the field?
We've had a couple people reach out to us who are doing some research kind of in the area of certainly site-specific theater and interactive historic theater. There's certainly a fair amount of escape rooms that do have historic themes and context. It's something that the general public seems to be very interested in as well. You know, like if you can have it's common to have Egyptian pyramid themed escape rooms and things like that as well.
I think that we've gotten questions from like the University of Essex. My former creative partner is getting his PhD at Trent in theater history, and he's using live history basically as his thesis for what is being done. Every once in a while we get emails like so yes, there is a lot, and those questions are coming to us. So that would be an awesome topic, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully we didn't misunderstand your question, and that's what you were asking. Cool. We'll see if any other, I think that's the same one. Yeah, because there's just one. So we'll see if any others pop up. But if there are no more questions, like thank you all so much for listening to us and sitting here and being like, oh, these guys aren't in an escape room. What are we doing? We hope that it's helped to make your escape rooms a little more historically accurate while still giving you the feeling of the game and fun. And we hope to see you all out at our show. It would be lovely to have that support. Because we travel the world, we also often feel like we're lonely and we don't have a community. We're bouncing from show to show and place to place. So thank you so much for having us. Do you have any final?
We really like to thank you guys for taking the time to share your knowledge. We appreciate it through the Escape Summit here. And we hope that we get to see one of your shows.
Yeah, come out on Saturday. It will be so exciting, but also the puzzles will be solved in like 2 seconds with this crowd.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. We tend to err on the side of escape room light with most of our puzzles.
Not all of them.
Not all of them by any means, but because there's often a lot of other things happening during our productions in terms of the theater. You don't want...
we want to tell the history as much as we can while having the puzzles. We want people to feel like they've stepped back in time, and this is how we do it. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
Sounds like a lot of fun.
Cool.
Okay, so thank you so much, and that'll be that.
Great.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, bye now.
Bye.
Bye.